Hi all, welcome back to Make More Bonsai, John here. Wow, check out this overgrown fuzz ball of a juniper. This is a great example of a tree that is healthy and full of energy, and it's ready for some good times and initial bonsai styling. Always look for these features when you're setting sail on a new bonsai adventure. You want the tree to be super healthy and growing aggressively, so it'll respond to the extreme pruning and wiring with enough energy to push past the stress and emerge a few months later looking strong and ready for more fun. So let's waste no time and get started by cleaning up and uncovering what this tree has to offer. I think anyone who has been growing bonsai for a while will identify with this statement. We've all had a tree or two that we started working on and had to set it aside to recover for long periods of time, like 2 to 5 years. This juniper is one of those, which is why I'm excited to finally get back to the business of developing this tree, pushing it forward toward a bonsai goal. And if you're new to bonsai, don't worry, this will happen to you, which is great news because it's always awesome to have something to look forward to get us through the day-to-day muck and grind. Currently, it's late winter, which is a good time to do any of this stressful bonsai work on a juniper, like setting up basic structure of trunks and branches using wire, and we can also prune more aggressively to redirect growth. We're going to take advantage of these favorable conditions to set up some main structural styling on the tree. One thing I'm noticing is there is a large branch, almost as thick as the trunk it's emerging from, which is cool, or is it? I'm going to cover up with a towel to kind of hide it to see if that helps to see if it has a major role to play in this tree. An important thing to consider with a tree this size, roughly 12 to 14 inches high, if the branches are within a range of proportion that lends itself to look like a tree in nature, I think I need to explain that better. I'm going to paraphrase something John Naka, an accomplished bonsai teacher, once said. Don't try to make the tree look like a bonsai. Make the bonsai look like a tree, or something to that effect. But the message is clear. When considering design choices, choose what looks more like what a tree would look like. Okay, so here's a tree with a fixed width to the trunk. It doesn't matter how wide, it's just the given material. What would deliver the impression of a larger or taller tree? Branches that are about 2/3 or more the width of the trunk, or branches that are 1/3 or less emerging from the trunk? Opinions may vary, of course, and depending on what the tree has to offer as well. So let's just say we have both options on the same tree, which we do right now on this juniper. In general, if you want the tree to look larger, the branches need to be smaller in width and length to appear proportional to the desired perception of height within the framework of the bonsai. We're sort of creating the illusion of a large tree in miniature after all. Now, if the branches are big and chunky and almost as wide as the main trunk, we're certainly making that illusion a bit more difficult for the viewer to easily identify. In certain instances it can be done, I think, but in this case, we are super lucky to have a juniper that's lousy with branches and choices. So I think we're gonna lean toward a more proportional design while setting up the initial structure for this tree. And more luck, we can use that branch within the design as a Jin. This little juniper just keeps on giving. While we're theory crafting, I'm very unsure of the correct planting angle of this tree should be. It has kind of an S-shaped trunk, both the live and the long Jin and Shari all kind of doing the same thing. I want to embrace that right now and see if we can make it all work somehow. For now, this angle will help us see into the tree more, so let's start here. Let's convert that unneeded thick branch into a useful Jin that will help us bring the design more into focus. After removing all the small branches with the foliage, we are left with the main branch that will become the Jin. Using pliers, crush the live tissue to help separate it from the heartwood of the branch. Grip a section and try to create a break that can be dragged for as far as the tissue allows. This helps create a natural looking tear on the branch that will look more natural as it follows the direction and grain of the wood. To sort of carefully wrangle about half of the width to tear off toward the trunk. Once it's within the realm of what I want it to be lengthwise, I'm going to grab the smaller torn ends and with a circular twist, roll that portion toward the trunk to tear along the grain. There's a really long Jin and Shari already on the left side of the tree, so for contrast, I'm making this Jin shorter. I'm going to let the Jin dry out over the next few months before deciding any further action on that section of the tree. Once some structure has been defined within the branches, it'll be easier to decide what will look best within this design. The rest of the work for today will be dominated by setting up some branch structure and opening it up for more light to reach the inner branches. So, how did this juniper end up sitting idle for so long before getting to this point? This Shimpaku juniper wasn't always Shimpaku. I purchased a cool looking San Jose Juniper while at a bonsai convention maybe 10 years earlier. It had an interesting curvy trunk that caught my eye among the 10 other ones the vendor had for sale. When I started working on styling it, I found myself more excited about the lower half of the tree than the upper parts. The foliage of the San Jose is kinda weird. Sometimes it produces scaly mature foliage, and sometimes it produces the more open juvenile foliage. Rather than spend a ton of energy trying to keep the foliage consistent, I channeled that energy into a solution that would be more satisfying, which was to graft a Kishu Shimpaku juniper onto the trunk and work toward the best of both worlds, a trunk I like, with a foliage that will look more in proportion and remain consistent. After the graft was firmly attached and growing aggressively, the inconsistent foliage of the San Jose was removed, leaving behind that long Jin running up the center of the tree. The San Jose Juniper is kind of awesome because it develops and grows really fast compared to Shimpaku, mostly because it moves more resources through its thick cambium. When the Shimpaku is grafted onto the San Jose, the combination of dense Shimpaku foliage pulling from a larger pool of resources provided by the San Jose results in the Kishu graft grows at an accelerated rate because the San Jose rootstock can provide more resources due to its increased vascular activity. In only 3 years, that graft was healed over and a new trunk had formed that was way thicker than the Shimpaku would have developed on its own in that short period of time. That Frankenstein creation was left to gain some strength. Over that time, another problem was solved that came with the original San Jose Juniper. It was basically a pot-grown tree that was sort of trained into a curvy shape. The trunk itself was very, very round and robust and round. The thing about junipers as bonsai, a round even trunk kind of leaves something to be desired. It's like a curvy tube. I mean, it's fine, but it'll always kind of look like a pot-grown tree, unless we take on the challenge and add some irregularity, some character to it. Junipers have a live vein that travels from the root directly up through to support a branch. If one of those veins die back, the remaining living veins grow over it and it creates some irregular texture. Over time, as sections die off, new sections grow over them and the trunk captures that ebb and flow of growth and change in the form of a more irregular, lumpy, or ropey kind of folded fabric texture. The live veins on the trunk began to die back as the San Jose branches connected to them were removed after the Shimpaku graft was strong enough to support the whole tree. Meanwhile, the vein that the Shimpaku was grafted onto has been widening and growing over the dead section at an accelerated rate because the Shimpaku-San Jose combo really increases the vascular activity. The original rounded, tubular-looking trunk is getting enveloped and that ebb and flow irregularity is starting to really become evident. So, combined with the large section of deadwood on the tree that travels up through and past the foliage mass in one clear Jin and Shari combo, this really adds some interest and value to the bonsai overall. So, our goal for this session is really to set up some structure to the branches that will expose the interior portions to more light, that will encourage buds along the length of the branches to prune back to achieve a proportional branch width and length ratio that will create the visual illusion of a larger tree, but, small, to make the bonsai look like a tree. Let's add a goal for the rest of the year to the list while we're here. After this tree recovers from today's fun and games, let's return to this tree midsummer and see how we can refine our choices and reinforce with some design choices that add more asymmetry to the design, and refine that lower trunk to roughen it up a bit to enhance that appearance of age and venerability to the tree. With those lofty goals in mind, let's see how we can make that all happen and assess what the current design strengths and choices are. Wire has been applied to all of the main branches. This will accomplish two major things. A, expose the interior of the tree to more light, which will stimulate new growth over spring. This new growth will help us decide where to prune back to further help condense the foliage mass. This in turn will help us reach the design goal of proportional branches. And two, reveal the groovy features that were hidden behind all of that bushy foliage. With all the branches organized, we can clearly see the directional changes of the long Jin and Shari and the dead original trunk, and see the full extent of the curves within the live grafted trunk. By placing the branches strategically behind the long Jin, we are free to place the remaining 4 or 5 branches to create asymmetry and also break up the view with some foliage. We can see from above these branches are spread out all around the trunk, as well as the apex also being rather evenly spread out in all directions from the top. That one long branch that is descending along the upper curve also has a character worth developing in the future, and may provide an added element of asymmetry with the contrast of a downward flow of direction. We will see how these elements evolve after about 6 months of recovery and growth, and maybe make some more design decisions around late summer. Let's fast forward to mid-August, roughly 6 months after the initial wiring. First, let's note, a lot of new growth has emerged, so mission accomplished. In fact, throughout the entire tree, new buds have developed on the interior and are now beginning to stretch and elongate. These are all signs of health and readiness for some future bonsai training. This is great news. It's a signal that we can do a little more refinement to the design of this tree. Junipers get most of their energy from their foliage and the sugars they produce. Since the foliage mass on this tree has more or less doubled in 6 months, we have lots of energy flowing through the tree. Why so much growth? Since this is a Shimpaku grafted onto a San Jose Juniper trunk and roots, the Shimpaku foliage is receiving lots and lots of resources from the more active vascular system and thicker roots of the San Jose Juniper. With all of this working in our favor, we can pursue updating the design by removing another large, out of proportion branch like the one on the lower right. It's not as thick as the one we created a gin from earlier this year, but if we hide that branch, we can see how dramatically the design changes when it's removed, bringing the foliage back towards the base of the tree and further compacting the overall foliage mass and balance of the design of the tree. That's all the convincing I need. Let's add another gin branch to the tree on the right side, which will enhance the theme of the other existing gin branches that already are established. Just like we did earlier this year, remove all the foliage and strip away the living tissue to expose the wood. The result of this change in direction from the tree leaning to the right to a contrasting gesture of movement that brings the eye back to the center of the tree, it brings emphasis back to the trunk, which is a really strong feature in the design. Let's elevate this tree onto our most versatile bonsai tool, our best friend the milk crate, so we can get a better view into the trunk. I'm also still very undecided on what the planting angle of this tree should be. So at this time, we're going to lean it a bit forward and spend some time living with it this way as we embark on the next bit of work to do on the tree this summer, which is to clean up and refine that deadwood, especially the main trunk. Remember when I was talking about how the original rounded, tubular-looking trunk is enhanced by the living section growing over it to bring irregularities and texture to the trunk? Since we are finished pruning until next year, why not spend some time enhancing that deadwood with some carving, and using this power tool, a Dremel, to create some natural-looking nuances to that smooth, really round-looking lower trunk shari. I've had this little Dremel for decades, but there are other similar rotary tools out there. Try out a few and see what works best for you. For us to really explore our options, let's look at some real-world examples and maybe find a way to illustrate what we're trying to convey using some visual shorthand to communicate the history and processes that occur over nature. What do I mean by visual shorthand? When you look at a painting or a sculpture of something in real life, what you are seeing is a representation of that person or thing. Painters use light and shadow to portray depth, or line to suggest the existence of whatever it is, and the viewer's mind fills in the gaps. Hair can be illustrated with a few wide strokes and maybe a few narrow strokes. Same thing with, say, a sculpted bust of a person. Those aren't eyeballs or teeth, they're suggestions of their existence. You don't see every hair or pore on the skin, but you are still able to recognize and accept that this is an abstract interpretation of whatever this given thing is. Every artist is different, and you're able to identify the artist through their style of interpretation. Some actually go as far as to create each pore in the skin of a face or every eyelash. Others merely suggest them and explore just how minimal that suggestion needs to be to efficiently visually describe any given thing. The same thing applies to bonsai. There are folks who will work tirelessly for hours creating every fissure to create a refined detail in deadwood. Others leave large shapes that simply imply the aging exists, and depending on size and proportions, kind of lets the viewer's eye fill in the details. For example, here's a juniper I photographed on a recent trip to Arizona. From this perspective of several feet away, we can see the entire tree. We can see there are multiple live areas and also a ton of history wrapped up in a convoluted tangle of dieback and regrowth over a long, long life of a variety of hardship and tenacity. That message is delivered in its entirety without being able to see every fissure in the Deadwood, but we know it's there. Another message delivered is, man, I'd hate to trip and fall on that tree. That would definitely hurt a lot. But I digress. Now, same tree, much closer, in a very different perspective. We can in fact see and count and identify every scar, every bore or wormhole, every frayed edge to a maddening degree. This is the range of detail one can explore, depending on just how deep into the experience you're trying to convey can be. Now let's try this. It's an old painter's tool to help you construct the major proportions and main shapes within an image. Squint your eyes until the details disappear and all you can see is major shapes of dark and light and contrast. Take it all in. Now, still squinting, find a feature that speaks to you that says, I can still identify this as Deadwood, but I also see the major shapes that make up the composition that can be interpreted as Deadwood. This is a middle ground, a path to a visual shorthand that communicates the age and venerability of a convoluted tangle of dieback and regrowth over a long, long life of a variety of hardship and tenacity. I'm going to pick a few details that we can apply to our bonsai in progress that will help communicate a natural Jin and Shari using visual shorthand and work some suggestion of that into the trunk of this tree. Here's an example of new growth that once covered an area in which the live vein died back, and then over time itself had also succumbed to some hardship. See how there's a ridge that kind of looks like a fold of fabric? That's a nice feature to incorporate into the trunk with some play of shadows carved into the wood. And here's a branch that broke off a gazillion years ago. We can see there are still parts of it hanging on over a deep hole of what used to be that branch that has rotted away. This is also a great feature to incorporate into a design. Okay, back to our reality. Let's see what we can do to bring to this composition some elements that remind us of those real-world examples, and try to work some aspects into this tree to create the abstract interpretation of a large tree in miniature that can convey aspects of these elements in perspective to the size and space the bonsai inhabits. What is really nice is there's a clear line between living and dead tissue. No need to explore where that edge is. It's pretty obvious that the live tissue is swollen and enveloping the dead trunk. I only need to use a wire brush attachment on this Dremel to clear away any leftover bark. I also like to use a smaller carving bit to clean out and define the edge between the living tissue and the shari. We do have a feature midway up the trunk, a hole that's begun to decay a bit. We can use that as a launching point for some definition and refinement along the trunk. This definition will help to create the natural ebb and flow of dieback and regrowth happening along a juniper trunk as portions of the live vein are grown over after a section stops functioning and is overtaken by an expanding live vein. Then, after some time has passed, that live vein also died back, revealing the strip of tissue that had grown over, which would appear raised, but also no longer living. Carefully follow a line, in this case all revolving around that knothole, and try to imitate how that tissue would have grown over to leave behind a raised area. I'm also kind of working in the direction of the grain of the wood, so when it decays a bit, it will blend in. You can get as detailed as you like. I prefer to create the raised area by removing strips around it, all in a long enough length to confirm there's enough play of light and shadow along the length of the area. I'm using different sized bits. The larger one will remove more wood in a wider profile. The smaller bit will provide more control over detail work. I am in this case keeping the detail to a broad overall shaping. This tree is maybe going to be 12 or 14 inches tall at most, so the perspective is more one of standing at a distance from the tree. These lines and ridges are an abstraction, a generalization of detail to bring focus to the broader concept of aged deadwood. Although they are realistic in size, as if one were much closer, to provide a kind of zoom in on the trunk within the design of the bonsai, think of it as if you were to hold a telescope up to one eye, while the other eye views the entire bonsai. This is the element of abstract interpretation I mentioned earlier. You're capturing a close-up view as well as an overall view, all within the framework of the design of the bonsai. If much more detail were worked into the wood, in many ways, it would serve to disconnect the viewer from the uncanny valley between reality and an illusion of reality. If the tree were larger, maybe 36 inches or more, the detail can be more intricate and fit within the space. The perspective shifts from a faraway view with such a large tree to a closer, more intimate experience. The goal is to find that balance between conveying a message of suspension of disbelief to the illusion successfully, or maybe going a little too far and failing to capture that illusion. We are not polishing the wood smooth. We are in fact exposing more wood to the elements that will over time dry out, crack, and decay. That will contribute to it looking more natural, much better than maybe any tool can provide. Over time, water will seep into the newly exposed fissures in the wood. In summer, it'll shrink and dehydrate within the fissures. In the winter, water will freeze, expand, and crack open, revealing more texture. Notice, I'm mostly using two hands to maintain control over this high-speed, sharp power tool that can chop through wood like butter. It can jump around, it's noisy and messy, and it's easy to get distracted. Two hands really helps you maintain focus on what you're doing, so you can avoid injury. Eye protection is also a must, because these tools blast sawdust right at your face, which is also a distraction. I guess I'm saying follow the ABC rule. A always, B B, C careful. And have some fun. Dusty, noisy fun. Moving on from the trunk, let's see if we can add some detail and callbacks to natural effects on the upper Jin and Shari, inspired by that image we looked at earlier. If we use the smaller bit and start to carve in and sort of hollow out some of the Jins, we can begin to deliver that look of a broken branch that the center wood has rotted and fallen off, creating some play between light and shadow. Choose one or two to perform this on, but not all. The inconsistency will contribute to it appearing more natural and random. Digging into the center of a few sections, creating a fairly deep hole so the viewer doesn't see where it ends, will also help deliver the suspension of disbelief goal, more interplay of light and shadow to add to the texture. To finish up, I'm using a wire brush bit to clean up and scrape off any excess bark and debris, and to kind of damage the tissue of the wood so it can absorb water and dry out in the sun over the rest of the summer and autumn before maybe returning to inspect how things are looking. I'm currently satisfied with how far this carving session has taken the tree. The next thing to do is place it back on the bench and expose the newly carved areas to the elements over the next few months. During that time, I'll be reviewing how the carving reacts with different light throughout the day and note any areas that might need some more development. I'm not going to try to preserve this wood yet. I want more decay to happen. Generally, applying lime sulfur to the deadwood slows down the effects of decay and also bleaches the wood, which provides a strong contrast between the living and the dead sections of the tree. I'm going to make sure I'm happy with the carving before I apply lime sulfur. Here's a pro tip. Lime sulfur stinks, like sulfur. When using a power tool to carve wood that has been treated with lime sulfur, it also reeks of, you guessed it, a lime sulfur. So, unless you want to spend an elongated period of time in a dense fog of lactose and beer farts, holding off treating the wood is definitely the way to go, at least for me. If I do need to return with the Dremel to refine a few areas, I prefer the natural cedar scent of the wood when refining any sections. The experience is way more pleasant when you aren't stinking up the place. I think we're at a point in which we can set this tree aside for the rest of the year. In the near future, I think this tree will be ready for a transplant into a bonsai container. That'll maybe make for a really satisfying future video that pushes this tree into its next stages of refinement. Until then, thanks for watching. I hope you gained some helpful insights from this little video. Maybe like and subscribe and leave a comment below, and possibly check out the book or the t-shirt and hat links in the show more section below. There's even a super thanks option available as well. Special thanks to everyone who chose to champion this channel with that little heart button. Your participation and support really helps energize this little production and helps me dream up and carve out new stuff to show you, because bonsai stuff is kinda cool, and so are you for helping support this channel.